Welcome to the Two Beans in a Pod. Listener, today we're diving straight into the turbulent situation in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's constantly shifting, isn't it?
It really is. You've shared a whole stack of recent news articles, some YouTube commentary too, and, well, our goal today is to try and synthesize these different strands.
Exactly. Give you a clear picture, hopefully, of where things actually stand and, what the potential paths forward might look like. It's complex.
Definitely. So we've got reports from, let's see, TVP World's Ukraine this week. They're covering recent attacks and this proposed U.S. peace plan.
And PBS NewsHour chimed in on those deadly strikes on Kiev and the reactions to the peace deal.
Send the Independent, they're looking at President Trump's, well, maybe shifting stance on Putin, potential sanctions, his meeting with Zelensky.
Right. And Sky News adds bits on that car bombing in Moscow, the Putin-Witkoff talks claims about Crimea.
And finally, Alexander McCurris on YouTube. He's got a deeper dive on the American and European proposals, the dynamics between everyone, U.S., Russia, Ukraine, Europe.
It's quite a mix. So, okay, let's try and break down what's really critical here. What are the key pieces?
Let's start with the situation on the ground. 'Cause
Yeah.
It's been grim. There's been a definite escalation in Russian attacks lately.
Yeah, that April 24th attack on Kyiv.
Yeah.
That was particularly bad.
Horrific. At least 12 civilians killed, 90 injured, children among them.
And that made it the deadliest attack on the capital since, July last year?
That's right. A long time. And Zelensky added another layer to that, didn't he?
He did. He reported that the missile itself, the one that hit Kyiv, was apparently supplied by North Korea.
Which, if true, suggests, a deepening involvement from external players arming Russia.
Absolutely. It's a significant claim.
Interestingly, though, this brutality, it did prompt a rare public comment from President Trump.
Yeah, urging Putin to stop the attacks, emphasizing peace.
Right. But that call comes against, a whole barrage of other attacks across Ukraine around the same time.
It does. Kharkiv got hit with 7 missiles.
And Marin, that drone attack on a bus, 9 killed, about 50 wounded, just awful.
Then Pavlovad, another drone, 3 dead, including a child, 10 or so wounded. Zaporizhia, a missile strike, 1 killed, 23 wounded.
Plus Khark, the Khan region, Odessa, more casualties everywhere. It's relentless.
And remember that Easter ceasefire Putin announced.
Yeah.
Reports say it was violated over 3,000 times.
3,000. So much for a ceasefire. It just highlights the lack of trust, doesn't it?
Completely. The intensity hasn't really let up, despite the words.
Mark Toth, he's a U.S. security expert. He was on TVP World's YouTube channel.
Yeah.
He had a take on why these attacks are intensifying now.
Oh, yeah. What did he suggest?
He reckoned it's Putin's signaling control as negotiations might be starting. Sort of he called it a middle finger to Trump.
Right. Defiance.
And, depressingly, a continuation of targeting civilians, a pattern we've seen throughout.
That's a key point Toth makes. The stark difference between any diplomatic talk and the reality for Ukrainians on the ground. It makes you wonder what impact words alone can have.
Exactly. Which, I suppose, brings us neatly to this proposed U.S. peace plan and all the reactions it's getting.
Yeah, the outline seems to be freezing the current front lines, recognizing Russian control over Crimea,
The big one.
and Ukraine barred from joining NATO. In return, security guarantees from Europe, financial aid for rebuilding.
Okay. But Zelensky's reaction, pretty immediate. Right?
Oh, instant and strong. A firm rejection. He was clear. Ukraine will not legally recognize the occupation of Crimea. Period. Said it's a fundamental principle in their constitution.
So Crimea is really the absolute deal breaker, it seems.
It certainly looks like it from Kyiv's perspective.
And the Trump administration, they've reportedly warned they might just, walk away from mediating if there's no progress.
That's the report. Which is interesting because it feels like a shift from, say, Mike Pompeo's declaration back in 2018 during Trump's first term.
Right, when the U.S. explicitly stated non-recognition of Crimea as Russian. So a potential policy change there.
Potentially. And it's causing ripples. The French foreign minister, for instance, has publicly doubted if a deal is even feasible right now, given Russia's actions.
Skepticism from Europe. And wasn't there a meeting in London that got downgraded?
Yeah, apparently Marco Rubio couldn't make it, so the meeting was, let's say, less high-level than planned.
Yeah.
It just shows the complications, the potential disagreements bubbling up around these terms.
And Mark Toth, again, on TVP World's YouTube, he was pretty scathing about the U.S. plan itself.
What was his main criticism?
He argued it basically gives Russia everything it wants up front and really damages U.S. credibility, makes the U.S. look like anything but an honest broker.
That really gets to the heart of the Crimea debate, doesn't it? You have the arguments for recognizing Russian control. It was taken back in 2014 without a huge fight. Ukraine hasn't really been able to retake it.
Mm-hmm. The realpolitik arguments, maybe.
Exactly. But then the counter-arguments based firmly on international law, the principle of not rewarding conquest by force.
Absolutely crucial principles. And Crimea isn't just symbolic, is it? Strategically.
Hugely important. Controlling Black Sea shipping, those rare earth minerals everyone talks about,
Right.
and preventing future attacks on Odessa. If Crimea is formally recognized as Russian, some argue that's a long-term security threat right on the EU's doorstep.
Okay, so let's pivot slightly to President Trump himself. His recent statements and actions, they seem a bit, well, mixed.
You could say that. On Truth Social, he actually expressed some doubt about Putin genuinely wanting to end the war.
After meeting Zelensky, right?
Right.
At the Pope's funeral.
That's the context, yeah.
Yeah.
And he even floated the idea of more sanctions, mentioned banking or secondary sanctions.
Which, just to clarify for the listener, are sanctions targeting non-Russian companies that still do business with Russia.
Exactly, hitting their facilitators. But at the same time,
Yeah.
the Kremlin puts out a statement saying Putin told Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, that Russia is ready for talks, no preconditions.
And Trump himself has been saying they're very close to a deal between the U.S. and Russia.
Which seems difficult to square with the very public disagreements, especially over Crimea.
It paints a confusing picture. Zelensky's account of his meeting with Trump was positive, but sort of vague.
While Macron, over in France, said Ukraine is ready for an unconditional ceasefire and the coalition of the willing is still working towards peace.
And remember Trump's old claim about ending the war on day one? He
Yeah.
apparently walked that back a bit, said it was said in jest.
Interesting. But then, in that Time interview,
He was pretty direct, wasn't he? He said, Crimea will stay with Russia, and he thinks Zelensky understands that.
quite a statement. And meanwhile, back in Washington, there are reports of a bipartisan Senate bill pushing for more sanctions on Russia.
So a lot of different signals. Trump says peace deal work is going smoothly, but then he's also pushing Ukraine to sign this rare earths deal with the U.S. immediately.
It suggests maybe multiple tracks: diplomacy, economic interests, domestic politics, all potentially playing out at once.
It could be. Now, Alexander Mercouris, on his YouTube channel, he focused a lot on those Putin-Witkoff negotiations.
Yeah, he really emphasized the directness of that channel.
Yeah.
Trump and Putin talking, with Witkoff acting as the go-between, the shuttle diplomat.
And the Kremlin being tight-lipped about the details.
Mercouris points out that's standard Russian practice during active negotiations. Lavrov, the foreign minister, has explained that before. They don't give running commentary.
But Putin's aide, Ushakov, did give a little hint.
A little, yeah. Called the 3-hour talk with Witkoff constructive and quite useful. Said it brought positions closer on Ukraine and maybe other things too.
Like Iran, perhaps. Economic stuff.
That's the speculation, yes. Things beyond just the immediate conflict.
And Mercouris talks about this Kellogg Plus plan. What's that exactly?
Well, based on the sources, Mercouris describes it as this evolving American proposal, likely being shaped by these direct U.S.-Russia talks. The details aren't fully public, but it seems like a framework.
A framework that might even allow for direct Russia-Ukraine talks down the line. On technical stuff, maybe.
Mercouris raises that possibility, yeah. Technical implementation before a ceasefire? Perhaps, even though Zelensky still has that decree banning direct talks with Putin personally.
It's complicated. So does Russia accept Kellogg Plus, according to Mercouris?
Not formally accepted, no. He says they see it more as a starting point, a basis for discussion. Their ultimate goal, he argues, remains what he calls Istanbul Plus.
Which means?
Control over all 4 of those regions Russia has claimed, in addition to Crimea.
And Mercouris thinks Kellogg Plus could potentially lead to Istanbul Plus. That they aren't necessarily contradictory.
That's his analysis, yes. That the initial framework might be a pathway for Russia to eventually achieve those broader territorial aims. It's a specific interpretation, of course.
Okay, let's bring it back to the view from Ukraine and Europe. Zelensky, as we said, insists complete unconditional ceasefire first. No talks before that.
And he rejected the U.S. plan, felt it conceded too much to Russia, and didn't come with enough pressure, like strong new sanctions.
Right. And the EU? Are they aligned with the U.S. here?
Doesn't sound like it entirely.
Yeah.
Reports suggest an EU counterproposal is floating around, demanding security guarantees from Washington and insisting on no territorial concessions before any ceasefire.
So a potential U.S.-EU split on the approach.
It looks that way. And yet Boris Johnson jumping in, quite critical of the U.S. plan, saying it offered Ukraine nothing, really highlights a divide.
Mark Toth, back on TVP World's YouTube, had that interesting, almost counterintuitive take.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
He suggested if the U.S. did back away from its hard line on Ukraine's territory, it might actually force Europe's hand, make them finally take more responsibility for their own defense.
That's a provocative thought. But it begs the question, doesn't it? Does Europe have the political will or even the capacity to really step up in that way, provide serious guarantees, massively increase support?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? We saw reports of European leaders Zelensky, Macron, Starmer apparently trying to get meetings with Trump in Rome.
Right, during the Pope's funeral events. Mercouris, on his channel, interpreted that as a sign of, well, maybe some desperation. A sign of the growing gap between the U.S. approach and what Ukraine and some Europeans want.
And that London Times report, pretty stark language, said Trump's plan to let Russia keep occupied land is set in stone.
And the threat to pull out of the peace process next week if there's no deal, that's applying serious pressure.
Presenting it to Zelensky as a take-it-or-take-it deal, apparently.
Wow, that's heavy pressure. Meanwhile, you've got concerns about European public opinion. Support for aid potentially waning because of economic problems at home, recession fears.
But Mercouris argues the opposite could happen, right, if U.S. aid is cut off.
His counterpoint is that it could trigger a much faster military and economic collapse for Ukraine. It's a terrible set of choices.
And it doesn't seem like Europe is united in pushing Zelensky to cave either. Some still feel a bad peace deal now is worse than continuing the fight.
Plus, Zelensky himself, he hasn't really made major concessions before, has he? Perhaps he believes deep down that if things get truly dire, the U.S. will step in more forcefully to prevent a total collapse.
It's a high-stakes gamble, if that's the thinking. What about that coalition of the willing Macron and Starmer were pushing? Sending troops?
That seems to have fizzled out, doesn't it? Reports suggest a lot of back and forth, maybe some blame shifting between the UK and France. The idea has apparently been shelved.
Replaced by talk of sending trainers?
Right.
Or maybe a no-fly zone just over western Ukraine?
Yeah, those ideas are circulating, though Russia has already rejected the no-fly zone concept.
And we're seeing other shifts in Europe, too. Italy reportedly stopping military aid?
That's the report, and they haven't publicly criticized the U.S. proposal either. Then you have Hungary and Slovakia quite clearly aligning with Trump's stance.
And Lavrov hinting France might want to re-engage with Russia.
Whispers, yes. It suggests the European consensus, if there ever truly was one, might be fracturing under the pressure.
Okay, let's quickly touch on the military situation itself, because the fighting hasn't stopped.
Far from it. Reports indicate Russia's formed a new military group of forces Kursk, up in the north.
Separate from their existing group of forces north?
Yes, which might signal plans for bigger offensives towards Sumy, maybe Chernihiv regions.
And heavy fighting elsewhere.
South of the Jerebets-Oskil rivers near Troitsky, reports say it's intense, and there's speculation about a potential Russian push towards Lyman soon.
Using a similar route as earlier in the war?
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
But the really critical area right now seems to be around Pakros.
Why Pakros specifically?
Russian forces are reportedly advancing both northeast and northwest of the city. If they manage to capture places like Miropivka and Sercheka, they could cut off the main E50 highway, a major Ukrainian supply route. That could lead to Pakros falling quite quickly.
A strategic linchpin, then.
Very much so. And there are also reports, maybe less confirmed, of Ukrainian defenses struggling down in southwest Donbass around Bogotyr.
So the military situation remains incredibly dynamic and dangerous?
Absolutely. Alongside all this diplomatic maneuvering, the war grinds on with terrible consequences.
We should also briefly note the sources mentioned other things bubbling up globally that India-Pakistan flare up, uncertainty around U.S.-China tariffs, but Ukraine is clearly dominating the immediate focus.
Okay, listener, so we've covered a huge amount of ground in this deep dive. What really leaps out, I think, is this intense, almost frantic diplomatic activity happening right alongside the continued brutal conflict.
Yeah, and this proposed U.S. peace plan, it's clearly stirred things up massively. It's exposed these pretty significant differences in priorities and perspectives between the U.S., Russia, Ukraine, and Europe.
It really has. And here's where it gets, particularly critical, I think. You've got this apparent gap, a chasm, really, between the U.S. pushing for a quick resolution, maybe on terms favorable to Russia in some ways.
Right, freezing the lines, conceding Crimea.
And Ukraine's absolute refusal to accept territorial concessions. That's their bedrock stance.
Compounded by the uncertainty around European support, will they step up? Can they? Or will they fracture?
Exactly. The outcome of all this, the negotiations, the pressure, and of course the actual fighting.
Yeah.
It's going to have massive consequences for Ukraine's future, obviously, but also for European security as a whole.
So, listener, what does this all mean for you? What should you be watching?
Well, definitely keep an eye on President Zelensky. Does he bend under this immense pressure? Watch Europe. Will they coalesce around stronger support, or will individual national interests take over?
And crucially, the battlefield, especially those key locations like Pakras we mentioned. The military reality often dictates the diplomatic possibilities, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Listener, if you found this deep dive, this analysis valuable and insightful,
Please do hit that like button. It really helps us know what kind of content you appreciate. And subscribe, of course, for more in-depth analysis.
yeah, we really aim to cut through the noise, synthesize these different reports, and give you the clarity you need on these critical global events. So hitting like and subscribing is a huge help.
It absolutely is. We try to pull it all together for you.
Thank you for listening to Two Beans in a Pod.
Thank you for listening to Two Beans in a Pod.